I wasn't expecting much from this town. That's why I chose it. After everything that had happened, I wanted a fresh start, something quiet, uneventful, somewhere far from my old life, far from the ghosts I had tried so hard to leave behind. The first few weeks went by as planned. I spent my mornings in the garden, afternoons at my new job at the local library, and evenings with nothing but a cup of tea and a good book for company. I liked the simplicity. I liked the peace. It was exactly what I needed. But all of that shattered the day I saw him. I was coming back from a grocery run, balancing 2 bags and fumbling with my keys when I glanced up. My breath caught in my throat. Nick. He was standing in front of the house next door, directing movers as they unloaded a truck full of boxes. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing some cruel trick on me. But no, it was him, older, harder, but unmistakably Nick. The man who had walked out of my life years ago without a word. The man who had left me with nothing but questions, heartbreak, and a void I tried so desperately to fill. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, the past crashing down on me with the weight of all the emotions I thought I'd buried. How could this be happening? After all these years, after everything I'd done to move on, he was here, in this small, quiet town. And now, he was my neighbor. I wanted to turn around, pretend I hadn't seen him, retreat to the safety of my house. But before I could move, his eyes met mine. For a split second, neither of us moved. The shock on his face mirrored my own. His expression was unreadable, part surprise, part something else I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Regret? I couldn't tell. "Emma," he said, his voice low, as if saying my name would shatter the fragile silence between us. I swallowed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Nick." He took a step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. For a moment, I thought he might smile, say something casual, like this was some normal, friendly reunion. But then his expression shifted, tightened. The warmth I expected wasn't there. "I didn't know you lived here," he said, his voice distant, guarded. I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. "Yeah, I guess neither of us planned this, did we?" Nick rubbed the back of his neck, glancing away for a moment. When he looked back at me, there was something hard in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, the anger bubbling up in my chest. "That's what you always say." He didn't answer, just stood there, the tension between us growing thicker by the second. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the world, leaving me standing in the middle of a storm I hadn't expected. "I can't do this right now," I muttered, finally tearing my gaze away from him. I grabbed my bags and turned toward my house, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. But as I opened the door, I couldn't help but glance back at him. He was still standing there, watching me with that same unreadable expression, and for a moment, I wondered what secrets he was hiding. I spent the rest of the day pacing my living room, unable to shake the shock of seeing Nick again. The memories of our relationship flooded back with painful clarity. How deeply I had fallen for him, how much I trusted him, and how completely he had disappeared from my life. For a while, I had convinced myself I'd never get closure, that whatever had driven him away wasn't something I'd ever understand. And now, just when I had finally let go of the past, here he was, in the house next door. I wanted to march over there and demand answers, make him explain why he left and why he was back now. But I couldn't. Not yet. Seeing him had stirred up too much. There was one thing I couldn't ignore, though. Something about him was different. Nick had always been guarded, sure, but there was a tension in him now that I hadn't seen before. He seemed on edge, like he was watching for something, or someone. I brushed the thought away, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A week passed, and I did my best to avoid him. But in a town this small, it was impossible not to run into each other. We'd pass by in the grocery store, share awkward nods when we crossed paths on the street. Each time, I felt the same mix of anger and curiosity bubbling inside me. Then, one evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I was in my garden, trimming the hedges, when I saw Nick outside. He was standing by his car, glancing around nervously, like he was looking for something or someone. His movements were quick, tense, like he was expecting danger at any moment. That was it. I couldn't keep ignoring the questions swirling in my head. I put down my shears and walked over to the fence separating our houses. "Nick," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. If anything, he seemed resigned, like he knew this conversation was inevitable. "Emma," he said, his voice low. I folded my arms, staring at him. "We need to talk." He glanced around again, clearly uneasy. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Too bad," I snapped. "You don't get to just walk back into my life and pretend like nothing happened. You owe me an explanation." Nick hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I do owe you an explanation. But this isn't the time." My frustration flared. "When is the time, Nick? You disappeared without a word, and now you're back, acting like I should just accept that." "It's not that simple," he said, his voice taut with emotion. "There are things going on that you don't understand." "Then explain them," I demanded. Nick stepped closer, his eyes dark and serious. "I can't. Not yet." "Why not?" I asked, my voice rising. "What are you so afraid of?" For a second, his guard slipped, and I saw it. Fear. Real, deep fear. "I'm trying to protect you, Emma," he said quietly, his voice strained. "The less you know, the better." I stared at him, my heart pounding. Protect me? From what? Nick glanced over his shoulder, his body tense, like he was expecting someone to jump out at any moment. When he turned back to me, his expression was cold, distant. "I can't say," he muttered. "Just trust me. Stay away from me. It's safer for you that way." He started to turn away, but I grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at me. "You don't get to do this again, Nick. You don't get to leave me in the dark." His eyes softened for just a moment, a flicker of the man I had once loved shining through. But then the mask fell back into place, and he pulled away from me. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, his voice hollow, "but you need to let this go." And just like that, he walked back into his house, leaving me standing there, angry and confused all over again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of Nick's words pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something much darker than I realized. There was danger lurking in his silence, something that wasn't just about our past, something that could get us both killed. Would you confront someone from your past if you thought they were hiding dangerous secrets? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Emma's about to uncover more than she bargained for, and it's only going to get worse from here. I couldn't get Nick's warning out of my head. He had told me to stay away from him, to let it go. But how could I? Something was wrong. I could feel it. The fear in his eyes, the way he kept checking over his shoulder. It wasn't just paranoia. Nick was hiding something dangerous, something that had nothing to do with our past and everything to do with why he had disappeared in the first place. But if he thought I was just going to forget about it, he didn't know me as well as he thought. The following days were full of tension. Nick and I didn't speak, but I watched him, quietly gathering information. He kept his distance, avoiding me at all costs, but I noticed the patterns. How he left the house at odd hours, how he'd always look around before getting in his car, how there were often unfamiliar vehicles parked near his house. And those weren't neighbors. Something was going on, and the more I observed, the more convinced I became that whatever Nick was mixed up in was dangerous. One night, I was lying in bed, replaying the last few days over and over in my mind, when I heard a car engine outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw Nick, slipping into his car under the cover of darkness. My pulse quickened. This was the third time that week I'd seen him leave in the middle of the night. I knew I shouldn't follow him. I knew it was reckless. But the curiosity, the need for answers, gnawed at me until I couldn't resist any longer. Grabbing my keys and jacket, I rushed out the door, hoping I wasn't too late. Nick's car turned off the main road and headed toward the outskirts of town, taking a narrow path that led to an abandoned warehouse. I parked a few streets away and walked the rest of the distance, staying hidden in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept closer to the warehouse. It was eerie, silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind. I crouched behind a stack of old pallets, keeping my eyes on Nick as he got out of the car. He walked quickly toward a side door of the warehouse, his movements tense. As soon as he disappeared inside, I moved closer, my pulse racing with a mix of fear and curiosity. Through a cracked window, I could see him inside, talking to a man I didn't recognize. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cold, calculating expression. Something about the way he stood, how he seemed to loom over Nick, set off alarm bells in my head. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but their body language told me all I needed to know. This was not a friendly conversation. Nick looked tense, his hands clenched at his sides, while the other man seemed to be laying out some kind of threat. Suddenly, Nick's voice rose, sharp and full of anger. "I told you, I don't have it." I froze, straining to hear more. The man stepped closer to Nick, his voice low but filled with menace. "You'd better find it, or you know what happens next." Nick didn't back down, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He said something in response, but I couldn't make out the words. The man shoved something into Nick's hands and stormed out of the warehouse, leaving Nick standing there, staring after him, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I crouched lower behind the pallets, hoping Nick wouldn't see me when he left. After a few minutes, he walked out of the warehouse, his face pale and his body tense. He got into his car and drove off, disappearing into the night. I stayed hidden for a few minutes, my mind racing with everything I had just seen. What had Nick gotten himself into? And what did the man mean when he said, "You know what happens next"? Whatever it was, I had a feeling Nick's life wasn't the only one in danger. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I marched over to Nick's house, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. I wasn't going to play this game anymore. He owed me the truth. When Nick opened the door, his face paled. He didn't look surprised to see me, but he did look wary. "Emma, not now." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You're going to tell me what's going on, Nick. I saw you last night. I saw you meeting with that man." For a second, his face went blank, and then he cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have followed me." "I had to. You won't tell me anything, and I'm not going to sit here pretending everything's fine when it's clearly not." Nick sighed, stepping back and motioning for me to come inside. I followed him into the living room, the tension between us thick and heavy. He paced in front of me, his jaw clenched, clearly struggling with what to say. Finally, he stopped and faced me, his expression pained. "I didn't want to drag you into this." "Into what, Nick?" I demanded, my frustration rising. "You keep saying you're protecting me, but from what? That man threatened you last night. What's going on?" Nick's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I saw the weight of whatever he was carrying. After I left you, I got involved with the wrong people." My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't interrupt. "I thought it was a way to make quick money," he continued, his voice low. "I got involved with a group that's into arms dealing. At first, I didn't ask questions. I just did what I was told. But when I found out what they were really doing, how deep it went, I wanted out. But it's not that simple. They don't let people leave." The room seemed to close in around me as his words sank in. Arms dealing. Nick had gotten mixed up with arms dealers. "I stole something from them," he admitted, his voice tight with guilt. Evidence, documents, files, things that could expose their whole operation. I thought it would keep me safe, that if I had leverage, they'd leave me alone. But they didn't, I whispered, my heart pounding. Nick shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. No, they've been hunting me ever since, and now they know I'm here. I stared at him, the full weight of the situation crashing down on me. This wasn't just about him leaving me anymore. This was something much bigger, much more dangerous. And what about last night? I asked, my voice trembling. That man, what did he want? They think I still have the evidence, Nick said, his eyes darkening. They want it back, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it. So give it to them. I said, my voice rising in desperation. Just give them what they want, and this can all be over. Nick shook his head, his expression grim. I don't have it anymore. I hid it somewhere safe, but I can't get to it now. And even if I could, they wouldn't let me walk away. Once they have it, I'm dead. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This was worse than I had imagined. The man I had once loved was being hunted by dangerous criminals, and now I was caught in the middle of it. My quiet, simple life had just turned into a nightmare. What about me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Am I in danger too? Nick's face softened, his eyes filled with guilt. Yes, I didn't want this, Emma. I didn't want to put you in danger. But now that they know we're connected, you're a target too. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the fear tightening in my chest. I had followed Nick into this mess, and now my life was at risk too. Later that night, I sat in my living room, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process everything Nick had told me. The weight of it all felt unbearable. I had come to this town to escape my past, to start fresh. But now, my past had come crashing back in a way I never expected, dragging me into something I didn't understand. Nick was in serious danger, and now, so was I. As I sat there, the pieces started falling into place. Nick had stolen evidence from dangerous people, people who wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And now, I was caught in the crossfire. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could trust Nick. But one thing was clear. We were both running out of time. What would you do if someone from your past pulled you into a life or death situation? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Emma's life has just taken a dangerous turn, and the stakes are only going to get higher from here. The next few days were a blur of fear and anxiety. Every creak in the floorboards, every car that passed by the house felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nick had tried to convince me to stay away, to let him handle it on his own, but it was too late for that. I was already involved. There was no running from it now. We were both caught in a web of danger that neither of us could escape. I was at work when the first sign of real trouble showed up. It had been a quiet morning at the library, and I was shelving books in the back when I noticed a man I hadn't seen before standing by the entrance. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his eyes scanned the room with a casual, but deliberate, intensity that made my skin crawl. He looked out of place, like someone who didn't belong in a small-town library. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But when I saw him glance in my direction, his gaze lingering a little too long, my heart started pounding. Was he one of them? One of the people hunting Nick? I ducked behind a bookshelf, trying to calm my racing heart. I peeked out again, and the man was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe I had overreacted, but then I saw him outside, standing by a black SUV, talking on the phone. His eyes flicked toward the library, and I quickly ducked out of sight. Something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and texted Nick. There's a guy at the library. I think he's watching me. It felt crazy to put it into words, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. A minute later, my phone buzzed. Nick, get out of there. Now. The urgency in his message sent a jolt of fear through me. I grabbed my bag and headed for the back exit, trying to keep calm as I slipped out the door. My hands were shaking as I got into my car and pulled away from the library. I checked the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the black SUV following me. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town. Nick was waiting for me at my house when I arrived. He was standing on the front porch, his face tense with worry. The moment I stepped out of the car, he rushed over to me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. "I'm fine," I said, though my heart was still pounding. "Who was that guy?" Nick glanced around, checking the street before answering. "I don't know, but if they're following you, it means they've figured out we're connected." My stomach twisted. "So, what now? What do we do?" Nick ran a hand through his hair, his expression grim. "We need to be more careful. They're getting closer. If they think you know where the evidence is, they'll use you to get to me." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy fog. I knew things were bad, but hearing him say it so plainly made it feel more real. I was a target now, just as much as he was. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see the black SUV parked down the street, its occupants waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the street was empty, silent. Nick stayed with me, though he paced the living room like a caged animal, restless and uneasy. He kept glancing at his phone, waiting for updates, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands twitched with anxiety. He was running out of time. "They won't stop, will they?" I asked, breaking the silence. Nick stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression dark. "No, not until they have the evidence." "And what happens if they get it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nick didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "If they get the evidence, we're dead." The days blurred together after that. We didn't leave the house unless it was absolutely necessary, and when we did, we were careful, always checking our surroundings, always making sure we weren't being followed. It felt like we were living in a constant state of paranoia, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But despite the fear, something unexpected was happening. Being around Nick again, seeing him every day, stirred up old memories, old feelings I thought I had buried. The way he looked at me sometimes, with that same intensity from years ago, reminded me of the connection we once had. But I couldn't forget why we were in this situation to begin with. He had kept secrets from me then, and now, we were tangled in a mess of even darker secrets. I didn't know if I could fully trust him, even though part of me still wanted to. One evening, as the tension between us grew too thick to ignore, I finally confronted him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight as we sat in the dimly lit living room. Nick looked up, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About us," I said, struggling to find the right words. "About everything. You left without saying a word, Nick. And now you're back, and I don't even know if I can trust you. I need to know where we stand." He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emma, I didn't want this. Any of this. I didn't want to leave you, but I had no choice. I was trying to protect you." "That's the problem," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "You keep saying you were protecting me, but you didn't give me a choice. You made decisions for both of us, and now look where we are." Nick's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But instead, he leaned forward, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "I know I messed up. I should have told you the truth back then, but I'm telling you now, everything I've done has been to keep you safe." I stared at him, my heart conflicted. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the regret. But could I trust it? Could I trust him? Before I could respond, a loud bang shattered the silence, followed by the sound of glass breaking. My blood ran cold. "Get down," Nick shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me to the floor just as another shot rang out. The front window was shattered, Shards of glass scattered across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I crawled behind the couch, my mind spinning with fear. "They found us," Nick muttered, his voice filled with dread. I peeked over the edge of the couch and saw a figure moving outside, their silhouette barely visible through the broken window. My stomach twisted in terror. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Nick pulled out his phone, his hands steady despite the chaos. "We have to move. They'll be coming inside any second." He dialed a number and spoke quickly into the phone, his words a blur. I could barely think, barely breathe. This was it, the moment everything came crashing down. "Emma," Nick said, his voice cutting through my panic. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, my heart pounding, and followed him toward the back door. My hands shook as I grabbed my bag, barely registering the fact that I was leaving my house, my safe place, behind. But there was no time to think, no time to worry about anything except surviving. We slipped out the back door and into the darkness, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. Nick's hand was on my arm, guiding me toward his car parked in the alley. My mind raced as I glanced back at the house, the broken window a stark reminder of how quickly everything had fallen apart. We got into the car, and Nick floored the gas, tires screeching as we sped away from the house. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To meet someone who can help us," Nick said, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Someone who knows how to deal with this." I didn't ask any more questions. I couldn't. All I could do was hold on and pray that we were going to make it through this alive. What would you do if your life was shattered in a single moment of violence? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Emma and Nick are running out of time, and the final confrontation is just around the corner. The car sped down the dark road, the silence between us thick with fear. Nick's hands were steady on the wheel, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, scanning for anyone following us. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat a reminder that our time was running out. "They'll keep coming," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the reality of our situation sinking deeper with every passing second. "Won't they?" Nick glanced at me, his face set with grim determination. "Yes, they won't stop until they get what they want." "And if they don't get it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They'll kill us." The words hung heavy in the air, but I had no energy left to react. I had known that from the start, even if I hadn't wanted to admit it. There was no escaping the danger we were in. No matter where we went, no matter how fast we ran, they would find us. The only way out was to confront them head-on. "Who are we meeting?" I asked, needing to focus on something, anything, other than the terror gnawing at me. "A contact," Nick said, his voice tense. "Someone I trust. He's helped me before." "How do you know he won't turn us in?" I asked, my distrust evident in my voice. After everything, I wasn't sure I could trust anyone. Nick's grip on the wheel tightened. "I don't have a choice, Emma. He's our only option." I nodded, even though my mind was screaming with doubt. Trust didn't come easily anymore. Not after all the lies, the secrets. But right now, I didn't have much of a choice either. We pulled up to an old, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Nick parked at the far end, hidden from the main road, and cut the engine. "This is it," he said quietly, glancing around the empty lot. I swallowed hard, my nerves frayed, but I nodded. We got out of the car, moving quickly toward one of the rooms. Nick knocked twice on the door, then stepped back, his body tense. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was older, with graying hair and a sharp, wary look in his eyes. He scanned the lot behind us before stepping aside, motioning for us to come in. "This is your contact?" I whispered to Nick as we stepped inside the dingy room. He's good, Nick said quietly, shutting the door behind us. He knows what he's doing. The man, who hadn't introduced himself, turned to us, his expression serious. You don't have much time. I've been monitoring the chatter. They know where you are, and they're closing in. I felt the blood drain from my face. So what do we do? Nick crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. We need to leak the evidence. All of it. We need to get ahead of them. The man nodded. I've got a secure channel ready. Once you upload the files, it'll be distributed to the press. After that, it's out of your hands. And what happens to us? I asked, fear twisting in my gut. They won't just let us walk away. The man's eyes flicked to me, then back to Nick. That's the risk you're taking. Once the story breaks, they'll be out for blood. You need to disappear. Disappearing sounded easier than it actually was. We had been on the run for what felt like an eternity, and yet no matter where we went, they were always just a step behind us. How much longer could we keep this up? Nick pulled the flash drive from his pocket, the weight of it seeming to drag him down. This tiny piece of plastic held all the evidence that could take down the arms dealers hunting us. It was the key to our freedom, or our destruction. Once I send this, we're done, Nick said, his voice low. There's no going back. He plugged the flash drive into the laptop on the table, and I watched as the files loaded onto the screen. My heart raced as the progress bar filled, every second ticking by like a countdown to the end. Finally, the upload was complete. The man pressed a few more keys, and the files were sent. It's done, he said, standing up. Now you need to go. I barely had time to process his words before the room was flooded with headlights. The roar of engines cut through the night, and I felt my heart stop. They were here. Nick grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back door. Run, he whispered urgently. We have to get out of here. But before we could move, the front door burst open, and 3 men stormed into the room, guns drawn. My blood ran cold as I recognized the leader, the same man I had seen in the warehouse, the one who had threatened Nick. Well, he sneered, his gun trained on Nick. I knew you'd come here. Thought you could outsmart us, huh? Nick pushed me behind him, his body tense, ready for a fight. You're too late, he said, his voice steady. The files are already out. It's over. The man's face twisted in anger. You think this is over? You think we care about your files? We'll kill you both before anyone has time to do anything about it. My heart pounded in my chest as the room closed in around us. This was it, the moment I had feared from the start. I could feel the danger, the inevitability of what was about to happen. We weren't going to make it out of here alive. But then something shifted. The man's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced down at the screen. His face paled. Boss, one of his men said, stepping forward. It's all over the news. The leader's eyes flicked to Nick, rage burning in them. You son of a... Before he could finish, the sound of sirens filled the air, getting louder and closer. The man cursed, backing away toward the door. This isn't over, he snarled, his gun still pointed at Nick. We'll find you. You can't run forever. Nick didn't respond, just stood there, watching as the men retreated, disappearing into the night. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. I exhaled a shaky breath, my body trembling as the adrenaline coursed through me. We did it, I whispered, hardly believing it. Nick nodded, but his face was still grim. We bought ourselves some time, but we need to go. Now. We didn't wait around for the fallout. As soon as the police arrived, we slipped out the back, disappearing into the shadows. Nick's contact had arranged a car for us, and we drove through the night, leaving everything behind. It felt surreal, like we had survived something impossible. But even as we sped away from the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Nick had exposed the syndicate, but there were always remnants, always people looking for revenge. We didn't speak much as we drove, the weight of what we had done hanging over us. We had won, for now, but we both knew that we would never be truly free. As dawn broke on the horizon, Nick glanced at me, his expression softening for the first time in days. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." I looked at him, my heart aching with the complicated mix of emotions I had been carrying. There was anger, yes, but there was also something else, something that hadn't disappeared, even after all the lies and danger. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't know if we'd ever stop running. But whatever happened next, we would face it together. What would you do if you finally escaped your past, only to realize it wasn't truly over? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Emma and Nick's journey isn't over yet, and you won't want to miss what happens next.